Once upon a time, there was a man named Greg. Greg was a simple man. He loved the woods, he loved the forest, he loved the birds, he loved working on the log cabin he had built in the woods. In short, he loved nature, and he loved peace, and he loved quiet. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, you will have to decide, Greg's wife and his child did not so much love calm and peace and outdoors. In fact, they loved noise and concerts and sporting events and all of the things that made Greg feel a little bit tired. But Greg still did manage to get them out into the woods into his cabin a couple times per year. And this is where our story begins. Greg, his wife, Mary, and his daughter, Marcia, were driving down a bumpy forest road towards his cabin. They had packed enough supplies to stay an entire week. Marcia was grumbling about how she wouldn't have internet service, but Greg told her that she would be able to read books, play with nature, and play board games with their family. And she quieted down, and Greg hoped that meant she was excited. His wife, Mary, was a little more excited, but of course she wasn't looking forward to living without running water and a restroom, for you see, all they had was an outhouse. But all in all, even if they weren't perfectly excited, Greg was very happy because this was his happy place. They arrived at the cabin, and as usual, the front porch was dusty, the railings were dusty. They went inside and it would need to be cleaned. So the whole family went about tidying the cabin, dusting and making it look sparkly new. Greg felt a sense of pride as he went into this cabin, for he had built this from the ground up with his own 2 hands. He had even done the electrical work, much to the protest of his wife, Mary. So if the house ever burns down, she will get to say, "I told you so." And they had a beautiful meal out on the front porch, listening to nothing but the sound of the wind gently caressing the leaves of the trees, the faraway howl of a wolf, the sound of birds chirping, and once they thought they even heard a grimace from a bear, but they couldn't be sure. It was a beautiful and wonderful night, and they all laid down and went to sleep. They had 3 more days like this. The days were spent hiking through the woods. Greg taught his daughter Marcia how to whittle. She showed her how to carve a little bear from a wooden stick. Mary sat on the front porch reading books. She did yoga in the front yard, and they generally enjoyed their time. They had 3 days like this, pure enjoyment, relaxation. However, on the 4th day, something happened that none of them were expecting, particularly Greg. He woke up early, as he tended to do, and went out to cook breakfast. He noticed that Mary wasn't in the bed next to him, and he thought, that's strange. Usually she gets up much later than I do. On the way in, he peeked to see his daughter, Marcia, and he noticed that she too was out of bed. And something else strange had happened. Her bed was very messy, and Marcia at home always made her bed first thing in the morning. It was a habit of hers, you might say. He started to become concerned, but he realized they were on vacation, and perhaps taking care of the bed was not the first thing on their mind. But when he walked into the living room of their cabin and he saw the front door open, he began to worry. It was not like Marcia to leave the front door open, nor Mary. And when he saw the strange footprints coming in and out of the cabin, he became even more worried, for these were footprints that were larger than his, and certainly larger than his wife and his daughter. And there was only one set of footprints coming into the cabin and going out. "Mary! Marcia!" he called. "Where are you guys?" No answer. He walked out to the front porch. His heart was pounding now. "Mary! Marcia! Where are you? Where have you gone?" Still, there was no sound. All he could hear were the usual peaceful sounds of the forest. He could see off into the distance where the footprints had gone, but over time, he lost them. He could notice small sticks and a couple footprints in the mud, but he wasn't a tracker. He had never practiced following people through the woods. He didn't know what to do, but he did know one thing. He was very, very, very nervous because his family had seemingly disappeared. So he went to the back of his pickup truck, where he had a secret compartment that neither his wife nor his daughter knew about. And from there, he drew his sword. Now you might be wondering, why does a man like Greg have a sword? Well, when he was young, he had had a very strange experience that he wasn't sure if he had imagined or if it had really happened. But the long and short of the story is he had gotten involved with a knight who was named Egon, and he had helped him foil a coven of witches from trying to overtake a town. And as a reward, Egon had given him this sword, and he told him this was one of only 5 swords like it in existence. It would never get dull. It would never rust. It would always be as sharp as the sharpest razor. And it was much lighter than a similar sword of its size should be, so it was very easy for a man like Greg, who didn't practice with the sword often, to wield. So he took the sword out, he put the sheath on his belt, he grabbed a backpack, put some food and water in it, and he started walking through the woods in the direction that he believed his family had disappeared. As I mentioned, he found a couple of footprints, and he could see places where a couple of sticks had been broken. He even noticed some blades of grass that were bent where they shouldn't have. But after about 50 yards, he was unable to follow their trail any further. So all he could do was walk forward in the direction he had last seen the footprints. And walk he did. He walked across a stream. He didn't see any new footprints. He walked through a very wooded pine forest where the trees were so close it almost made him feel like he was inside of a building. He noticed there weren't as many sounds of birds out here, and he could hear the sound of as some of the old pine trees wobbled back and forth in the wind. Still, he kept walking. He emerged into a field, and inside of this field, he saw beautiful grass starting to brown because the fall was rapidly approaching. But in the middle, he saw a stone. He walked over to it, planning just to sit on the stone and have some lunch and try to regroup and plan for himself. But as he got closer to the stone, he realized something was odd about it. It looked almost as if it had been polished. It was smooth, like the kind of rock you buy in a rock shop. The edges were unnaturally flat. And as he got closer, he saw on it words written on it. And these words filled him with an unease that perhaps they shouldn't have. For on the rock was written, "He who sits here must not have fear, for he will find himself in a world that isn't near." He had flashbacks to his memory of Egon and the friend he had met as a child, and he could remember Egon saying, "I am not from here." And he had always thought that just meant he was from another country, another land, another state. He didn't know. But seeing this stone, he had a feeling that he was about to embark upon the kind of adventure that perhaps he wasn't ready to. So Greg kept standing. He took out a couple of RX protein bars. He had some almonds, and he took some water and had a little bit of black tea to pep him up. And then he sat on the stone. And what happened next was unlike anything he had ever experienced. For when he sat, he could feel his body vibrating. It was as if every molecule in his body were simultaneously moving back and forth rapidly. And then his vision started going dark. But it didn't stay dark for long. A shade of rainbow colors colored everything around him. And he saw all of the objects around him fall, every molecule of them to the ground, almost as if it was like rain. And then there was a vast explosion of bright white light, and he closed his eyes because it was so bright. There was a humming sound that grew ever so loud. He had to plug his ears. And then it all stopped. When he opened his eyes, once more, he was in the field. But it wasn't the same field. The grass was shorter, as if spring had just begun. Instead of a pine forest surrounding him, it was a forest of birch and aspen and even a few oak trees. The birds chirped here loudly and more vibrantly than they ever had in the forest he was in. They had a different song, a brighter song. The sky seemed to be bluer than he ever remembered. The sun was brighter, but this is what gave it away. 2 crescent moons arced across the sky. He felt his heart pounding, and he felt panic swelling up and rising within his chest. He was able to get his breathing under control, because now he knew that this was where his family had come. And fortunately enough for him, it seemed as if it had recently rained in this world, for once more, he could see the footprints moving off in the distance. He tried to put his own foot in the footprint and realized whoever had this footprint had a foot at least twice as long as his were. Now, Greg wasn't a giant man, but he was around 6 foot tall, fairly well muscled, and had regular-sized feet. Whoever did this must have been huge. That filled him with a little bit of fear. However, he checked the sword at his side, which reassured him, and once again he set off following the footprints. This was a long journey that took him several days. He went through every imaginable permutation of a forest. Close, dense trees filled with streams and birds, through fields. He walked up a winding path that went over a massive hill and then back down again. He walked past a lake where the water was cyan. And over this went for several days. In the nighttime, he would take out his portable tent, set it up wherever he could, and sleep. Although sleep was not easy to come by. And when it did come, it was filled with dreams, memories of Marcia and Mary. And he would see them in a cage, or he would see them in a prison, or he would imagine them tied up to a tree. All of these horrific things he did not want to imagine. But still, he tried to sleep so that he would feel rested when he awoke the next morning. On the evening of the third day, as he was getting ready to set up camp, he heard a popping. He jumped and turned around. He thought, what if someone around him was following him and had broken a stick? But then he heard the popping again. This wasn't the popping of someone stepping on a twig and breaking it. This was the popping of a large log inside of a fire. Pop! He looked around. He couldn't see where the fire was coming from, but he kept hearing the popping, and so he crept towards that sound as quietly and stealthily as he was capable of. As dusk grew into night, he saw flickering flames in the trees ahead. He walked closer, careful not to step on a branch or run through a bush that would give him away. As quietly as he could, on the balls of his feet, he went until he came to the edge of a small clearing, in the center of which was a fire. Around the fire were 2 steel cages. Inside of one of the steel cages was his wife, Mary. Inside the other steel cage was his daughter, Marcia. They were very dirty. Their hair was messy from not having bathed in several days, but otherwise they looked well. He didn't see any blood or bruises on them, and for that, he felt thankful. That sense of thankfulness only lasted for a moment, because across from the cages, on the other side of the roaring fire, slept the giantest man that Greg had ever seen. He must have been 8 feet tall. His muscled arms were bigger than Greg's legs. He had a beard that ran all the way down to his waist, and he snored loudly. Greg had no illusions that he could defeat this person in combat, and he didn't want to try. So he crept as close as he could, as quietly as he could. When he got to the cage with his wife in it, he reached his arm through and tapped gently on her leg and then put his mouth to his face to indicate to her not to speak. She looked at him and she went, and then he once again did this, and she stopped. He whispered to her, I'm gonna get you out of here, be quiet. So he found where the lock on the cage was, and he took out his sword, and he tried to pry it open like a crowbar, but it wouldn't work. He went over to his daughter's cage, did the same thing, woke her up, and tried to pry her lock, but it wouldn't work. The steel was far too thick for him to cut through with his sword. He knew what must be done, although it scared him with a fright that he had never felt before. Towards the giant, he crept, tiptoeing on the balls of his feet, trying to creep as silent as a mountain lion, ready to pounce on its prey. As he got closer, the smell of the giant wafted into his nostrils, and he realized this creature was quite dirty. He pulled back the sleeping bag as gently as he could, not waking the giant. And on the giant's belt, he saw a series of keys. They were wooden keys, which he thought bizarre, but he reasoned that one of these must be the key to the cages. He took his sword and pulled the key as gently as he could and started cutting the belt, trying to cut through the belt and get the key ring off. Of course, that was very difficult to do, and he accidentally cut the giant, who immediately sat up. What is this? And the giant looked around in a rage. He saw Greg, and he said, what have we here? And Greg drew his sword and said, what is your name? The giant said, my name is Oleg, but I think you've got greater concerns than my name. And the giant lifted himself, stretched, popped his neck. Greg had been mistaken about his size. This creature was over 10 feet in height, taller than a basketball hoop. Its arms rippled, its legs rippled the muscles as they stood up. And it looked at Greg, popped its knuckles, and said, now we dance. and the giant lunged at Greg much faster than Greg would have expected a creature of its size to move. Greg darted backwards with a speed he did not know he possessed as adrenaline flooded his veins. And thus they started their dance. The giant would lunge and Greg would dodge, step backwards, roll forwards, whatever he had to do to escape. Greg's only hope was that this giant, because of how muscled and huge it was, would get tired before he. However, Greg was not a fighter, and this giant appeared to be. And so he realized, with sadness and fear, that he was getting tired before the giant, and in a matter of time, he would be unable to dodge any further. So he knew he had to do something. The giant had become so used to him running away, he did not expect what happened next. Greg did a somersault, rolled towards the flames, reached into the fire, and grabbed 2 hot logs with his bare hands, which burned terribly, but he threw them before they could do too much damage and hit the giant right in the face. The logs got sparks in his eyes, they burned his eyes, and the giant grabbed his face and started roaring around in pain. While that was happening, Greg jumped forward and cut the back of the giant's legs, both legs. He'd remembered a story of great heroes where to defeat a giant, the hero had to cut the muscle in the back of the giant's legs so that he could no longer run and chase. And so this is what he tried to do. The giant fell down on his knees and roared again. And the giant rubbed his eyes, and Greg could see that they were puffy and red, and it seemed like the giant couldn't see, for it was waving his arms around trying to grab and catch Greg at any chance he could get. The giant tried to raise himself up, but he fell back down each time. Greg didn't know if he had done permanent damage, if he had disabled the giant, or if the giant was just collecting himself, but he had no time to waste. He ran forward and grabbed the keys, which had fallen onto the ground near the giant's sleeping bag, and quickly tried to undo the lock of his wife and his daughter. Now, the giant knew what was happening, for he still had full power of his hearing. So as Greg started unlocking, the giant used his hearing to guide him towards the cages and started swiping around with his hands. Greg only had a few mere seconds to get these unlocked. He put the wrong key in first, then the wrong key. And finally, on the 3rd click, just as the giant was about to get to him, he got his wife's lock open. She scrambled out, ran behind the cage. And while she did, Greg ran over to his daughter and got her too. Well, you might be surprised to know that his daughter ran towards the giant, grabbed fistfuls of dirt and threw them in his eyes, and then said, "Daddy, this way!" Greg, not thinking, followed after her, as did his wife. Marcia ran headlong through the woods. And finally, once they had gotten far enough away and they couldn't hear the roaring and rampaging of the giant, Marcia and Mary said, "Thank you, Greg. Thank you for coming to us. Let me see your hands." Greg held out his hands. They were covered with blisters from grabbing the hot logs. His wife said, "Wow, that must have hurt. Thank you so much. You're so brave. Now, how do we get out of here?" And Greg said, "Oh, how did you guys get here?" And she said, "Well, we were sleeping in the cabin, and something came in and put a bag over my head. And then I heard my daughter next to us. We were both being carried under that giant's arms. I have no idea how we got here or where we are." And Greg said, "Follow me this way." And he led them as best as he could back to where the field with the rock was. At first, he wasn't sure where they were going, but eventually he started seeing signs of his footprints, and he was able to follow them back. Once again, it took them 3 days to get back. They went as fast as they could during the day, and at night, they set up the tent, which was very small, but all 3 of them didn't mind cuddling because of their fear. They set up the tent and put leaves and branches and grass over it so that it would camouflage into the nearby surroundings. One night, they swore they heard the faraway rampaging and raging of the giant, but it didn't come close enough to where it caused them any concern. And at the end of the 3rd day, they walked into the field, which he had emerged from the first time, and he saw the stone in the middle of it, and he rushed them all over to it. Now on this side, the rock had words on it once more, but they were in a language he didn't understand. And he said, sit with me." And so they all sat with him, and the same thing happened. The bright lights, the strange sounds, the feeling of being ripped apart molecule by molecule and being put back together, and they woke in the field that he had remembered. Now Greg didn't know if there were other creatures like the giant that would try to come through. He didn't think they'd be seeing the giant for some time, but he knew eventually that beast would heal, and he did not want it to come back through and harm someone else. He also imagined that anything coming through this rock portal was not something that would have the best interests of humans in mind. He ran to the forest and grabbed the biggest log he could find, and he wedged it under the rock and said, "Help me, help me." And so with his wife and his daughter, they managed to push the rock up and tip it over. And then they tested it. They sat on top of the other side of the stone, but nothing happened. The portal must only work one way. And then he had a thought. If the giant were to come through the portal, it would be smashed into the ground. He reasoned that the portal was safe enough, and he vowed that one day he would bring back some of his friends and they would dig a massive hole and bury this rock. But for now, he knew they were safe. And so their walk back to the cabin was calmer and freer than it had been before. And they all seemed to realize one thing, that the most important thing was that they were together. He had thought he had lost his wife and his daughter. And now that they were back, all he felt was gratitude and love. And it seemed as if they felt the same things for him. And I think all of them also knew that they probably would never go through another situation that was quite that scary. Once they got back to the cabin, they played board games and went to bed. And the next morning they left and went back to their house in town. And Marcia and Mary said, "Well, Greg, I guess we told you so about the forest being fun." And Greg chuckled and said, "Ha, ha, ha." But he did have to admit it was nice being back home with their lights and their heat and their water and their bathtub and all of their friends and family living close by. And that, my friend, is the story of the strange cabin and the giant from the other dimension. I would love to tell you all then, good night. I miss you, and I hope you're snuggled in as tight as you can be under those blankets and have the best sleep with the best dreams. My heart is always with you. Good night.